Hello and welcome to the Week 6 Supplemental Lecture on Frantz Fanon's The Pitfalls of National Consciousness. Fanon was trained as a psychiatrist and is involved, among other things, in treating people who were themselves involved in anti-colonial struggles or were affected by colonialism. He is a major theorist for post-colonial movements in his own time and today, and what he's looking at here are some of the things that go wrong with nationalist movements in a colonial and post-colonial context, to try to analyze how one might prevent these things from going wrong in the future. He is using a particular kind of Marxist analysis and is stretching at the boundaries of that analysis to work out what is different in looking at classes and class interests if you are talking about a colonial or post-colonial context from what might be the assumptions if you were doing that kind of analysis in the core. So he wants to analyze what's the relationship between nationalism and anti-colonialism, and he says initially there may not be one. You can have anti-colonial struggles that are quite local in character, that are about local working conditions or particular abuses by the state in particular circumstances, that are not necessarily understanding themselves in nationalist terms, and that are often appealing to liberal universals, so using the ideals of the colonial powers against the behavior of those powers on the ground in colonial contexts. And he says national consciousness can emerge later, but often takes quite problematic forms. And one of the reasons that he thinks that it takes problematic form is the state of the middle classes in African countries or in other post-colonial contexts at the point that they're able to finally take power. So you might have an expectation from something like the Communist Manifesto. So Fanon is using some Marxist analytical categories. And you might have an expectation there that the middle class, when it first takes power in a revolutionary context, is itself a revolutionary class. It blasts through traditional authority structures, it emancipates people from old superstitions, it revolutionizes the means of production. These are these images that we get from documents like the Communist Manifesto. And then at some later point, once the means of production are developed, the class becomes a brake on further progress, and you need a new kind of revolution that will take things further. Fanon is saying the problem is that the middle class in the post-colonial contexts doesn't seem to have that revolutionary character. And he wants to analyze why. Why is it that you don't get this period where it's at least blasting through traditional forms of authority? Why don't you get a revolution in the national economy to make it more productive? Why do you instead get something that looks an awful lot like colonialism itself, just administered by local elites who themselves have connections to colonial powers, rather than administered by the colonial powers themselves? And he says one of the material reasons this takes place is that, in fact, the local middle classes are quite limited. They are prevented from concentrating and accumulating large amounts of capital by the colonial regimes themselves. So when those regimes leave, when independence is secured, you have a middle class that is relatively well off compared to the rest of the country, but it has very few economic resources relative to the capitalist powers in the core. It also tends to be geographically quite heavily concentrated in capital and specialized in fairly undiversified industries. And this means that it is not very well grounded in the nation as a whole. It doesn't have much connection to the masses. Its connection is actually to the elites in the core, to the middle class in the former mother country. So when things start going wrong, when there's economic stagnation or problems, they don't go to the masses and negotiate a new solution in the name of everyone in the country. Instead, they immediately appeal for help back to the mother country. And so you can get post-colonial structures, financial and economic, that end up reinforcing and recreating old colonial relationships, even without direct colonial administration. And Fanon's concerned about that and is wondering how it's possible to prevent it. Now, he's offering an economic analysis, and it has Marxist overtones. So there is a notion of class interests and people behaving in terms of class interests, but this is not a deterministic analysis. It's not that he thinks that everybody has to behave in a certain way because economic forces are making them do it. He has this concept of an authentic middle class, the notion that you might have a middle class that could choose to do other than just enrich itself. He says you can get a middle class that would betray its purpose within capitalism. So its purpose within capitalism is to enrich itself as a class. But the middle class could decide to place itself in the service of its people instead. It has intellectual and technical capital that it's gained because it largely has training in universities in the core, and it could bring those skills and actually do something meaningful to develop the country and benefit everyone. But he says often it does not follow this heroic, positive, fruitful, and just path. Instead, it just orients to its own bourgeois interests and tries to enrich itself. And in doing this, it reinforces old colonial structures and helps to continue impoverishing the bulk of the population. So he talks about nationalist parties and the economy, and he says, you'd expect these parties, because they're talking about nationalizing the economy, to do something revolutionary with it, to transform it, to make it more productive, to increase and redistribute the wealth in society, but they don't do this. And he says they don't do it because really largely the way the economy actually works is outside their competence. They don't know much about it. They've got a very abstract relation, he says, to the actual material resources and possibilities of the countries that they govern. Their view of things is heavily biased toward the kind of resource extractive industries that are already very well developed from the colonial administration, and they don't have a good sense of what more to do to make a functioning national economy that will work in the interests of the people rather than in the interests of overseas powers and a very narrow local elite. So you often get economic stagnation, and people respond to that economic stagnation, the local elites respond to it, with a valorization of local artisanal production. And again, Fanon is not a romantic about this, and you can hear sort of echoes of sort of communist manifesto type preoccupations. He wants a revolutionization of local production. He doesn't want it to stay in its old traditional form. He wants a more productive, more industrialized, higher technical base that is transcending these traditional practices. And this is one of the things that he thinks is unusual about the local middle classes, is that they do not have this revolutionizing effect. They keep production more or less as it is and just skim their profits off the top. He says, since the middle classes find it impossible to set up factories that would be more profit-earning, both for themselves and for the country as a whole, they will surround the artisan class with a chauvinistic tenderness, in keeping with a new awareness of national dignity, and which, moreover, will bring them quite a lot of money. This cult of local products and its incapability to seek out new systems of management will be equally manifested by the bogging down of the national middle class in the methods of agricultural production, which are characteristic of the colonial period. So, the colonial countries, even after independence, continue basically to be resource-extractive economies. And he says, we go on sending out raw materials. We go on being Europe's small farmers who specialize in unfinished products. These same financial relationships are maintained even after the colonial administration goes away and they're no longer forced. They are a sort of a default rut into which the economy falls, and it's never revolutionized out of it. So value-added production goes offshore, it remains in the core, and the local economies are never properly developed. You do, however, have nationalization of the economy, and nationalization of the economy, again, in a particular kind of Marxist framework, is one of the things that you might do if you want to directly control it in a way that is revolutionary. But the nationalization that takes place in these ex-colonial countries doesn't place the economy in the service of the nation, Fanon says. Instead, it transfers into native hands those unfair advantages which are a legacy of the colonial period. So it's just replacing who's in charge. It's not fundamentally changing the structure of what happens. So he says, as a consequence, the local middle classes take over from the colonial powers, but they just become intermediaries for foreign capitalist concerns. And he talks about this as neocolonialism, and this is a term that we'll run into in other works, this term. Neocolonialism is the concept that even after the colonial administration goes away, even after countries could presumably transform their economies and do something different, you get a persistence of colonial forms of resource extraction imported to the same places that had been the colonial rulers, so that it's looking a lot like economic sanction and economic incentive replaces the old direct power of the colonial administration. It's called neocolonialism. So Fanon says you get a middle class that lacks the dynamic, transformative character of other middle classes. You might have revolutionary expectations for the middle class and what happens when it rises to power, but it doesn't play out that way in these newly independent countries. Instead, he said, it's like it skips right past its revolutionary period and just becomes decadent. It just skips forward to the state in which the middle classes are a brake on progress. He says it is already senile before it has come to know the petulance, the fearlessness, or the will to succeed of youth. Okay, so it's sort of useless all round. And he talks about the fact that it retains the old resource-extractive industries, the old forms of farming, and then it also starts catering to the entertainment needs of members of the Western elite. And he talks about this in extremely scathing terms as a sort of a decadent, kind of immoral activity. This is cut off and isolated from the nation. This class suffers from an incapacity to think in terms of all the problems of the nation as seen from the point of view of the whole of that nation. The national middle class will have nothing better to do than to take on the role of manager for Western enterprise, and it will in practice set up its country as the brothel of Europe. Agriculture is also nationalized, but he thinks that nationalization in this context again doesn't lead to any kind of revolution, it doesn't lead to intensification of production, it doesn't lead to the introduction of new technologies that might be labor-saving and increase output, and he thinks it actually privileges the new owners of centralized, nationalized property even more than the colonizers were privileged. So it's a hyper-concentration in local hands, but there's no redistribution of wealth, there's no improvement of productivity, there's nothing that benefits the nation as a whole. And he talks about this being driven by fear of risk. There's an intense focus on personal profits. You know what personal profits you can skim out of these modes of production that have been around for a long period of time, so you just stick with them and you use nationalization and the state to enforce your level of profits, possibly also to force labor out of the population. You display a lot of new wealth, you put your wealth, into luxury consumptions that visibly show that you're well off, but you are not considering the good of the nation as a whole, or indeed even your own long-term profits, which Fanon suggests in various places could even be higher if the middle class would just operate as a revolutionary middle class. And then he says, and there's a long section where he talks about how these various dynamics, the failure to properly develop a national economy, the failure to properly develop a national identity, lead to a spiral into racism. So you've got a hollowed-out nation without genuine or authentic bonds between people, without a genuine commitment to a common purpose, and you start getting racist discourses that unite people, racism that is black on white, and racism between different communities within Africa. So he says, what you get is an appeal to ideals of nationalization by the middle classes to secure positions that used to be held by European colonial staff. And he says this kind of appeal becomes more and more tinged by racism, until the bourgeoisie bluntly puts the problem to the government by saying, we must have these posts. They will not stop their snarling until they've taken every one. So he doesn't think that this is motivated by anything particularly ideal, it's just strict material self-interest posed in frankly racial terms in order to secure these posts. These posts at least are secured from departing European colonial administrators, but if you're lower down the economic hierarchy, your competitors are not outgoing European colonial staff. Your competitors are actually other Africans, either from other parts of Africa or even from other regions within your own state. So the racist articulation of bourgeois goals trickles down in Fanon's account and leads to a racism against non-national Africans and Africans from other communities other than your own. And he says, with this, from nationalism we have passed to ultranationalism, to chauvinism, and finally to racism. These foreigners are called on to leave, their shops are burned, their street stalls wrecked, and in fact the government of the Ivory Coast commands them to go, thus giving their national satisfaction. So you get a kind of fictitious unity mobilized around racism, rather than a substantive unity that reflects an actual progress and development in common purpose. He says, as we see it, the mechanism is identical in the two sets of circumstances. If the Europeans get in the way of the intellectuals and business bourgeoisie of the young nation, for the mass of people in the towns, competition is represented principally by Africans of another nation. We observe a permanent seesaw between African unity, which fades quicker and quicker into the mists of oblivion, and a heartbreaking return to chauvinism in its most bitter and detestable form. So the anti-colonial struggles he will talk about as being driven by ideals of African unity, and these ideals are still appealed to, but they're hollowed out and weakened by more proximate racist ideals that can pit Africans against other Africans. And then he talks about this ultimately becoming not just nationalism and not just a racism about nationality, but a regression back into tribalism. And he uses here the explicit vocabulary of enlightenment. He says this happens because there's been a failure to enlighten the masses. So there's a discourse here that is on board with the goal of enlightenment, of maturation, of progress, of development. It is very non-romantic about non-modern forms of social organization. It wants a fundamental revolution to go on in people's ways of life, and it wants something to replace tribal systems that is better than them. He says, in fact, everywhere that the national bourgeoisie has failed to break through to the people as a whole, to enlighten them, and to consider all problems in the first place with regard to them, a failure due to the bourgeoisie's attitude of mistrust and to the haziness of its political tenets, everywhere where the national bourgeoisie has shown itself incapable of extending its vision of the world sufficiently, we observe a falling back toward old tribal attitudes, and furious and sick at heart, we perceive that race feeling in its most exacerbated form is triumphing. Okay, so this is a very, very troubling development for Fanon, and he thinks that it is down to the fact that you have these massive struggles for independence. They succeed, but you don't get the revolutionary improvements from these struggles that you expect. So there's a falling back on older forms. And then he says you also have internal divisions that are not even traditional forms of tribalism. They're not even anything historically particularly old. The colonial system privileges certain areas. It doesn't deal equally with all parts of the area under its control. And so when it leaves these areas, there's some areas that are comparatively privileged. They're comparatively well off. And it generates advantages for them, and these advantages persist after colonialism ends, and you can get the advantaged sections of post-colonial regimes either going for independence themselves and trying to leave other regions behind that are more disadvantaged, or actively imposing forms of domination on the less advantaged regions that are very similar to the forms of domination that would be imposed by the colonial administration. And Fanon says you get federalism and regionalism and other kinds of very tense relations between smaller portions of communities, things that go on below the level of nations. So you had an ideal of African unity, and it's expressed as Fanon thinks a fairly vague ideal during the period of anti-colonial struggle. It's that African unity, that vague formula, yet one to which the men and women of Africa were passionately attached, and whose oppressive values served to bring immense pressure to bear on colonialism. African unity takes off its mask and crumbles to regionalism inside the hollow shell of nationality itself. So this is an ideal. It attracted the hopes and dreams of populations engaged in anti-colonial struggle, but when the colonial powers actually leave, when local elites take over, you get an unmasking of commitment to this ideal, and what you get is something that is much more fragmentary, much more hostile, much more hierarchical itself. It's the bourgeoisie are too focused on their own interests to try to bring into being national unity. You've got a dream of African unity that gets balkanized, it gets broken down into national communities, but even the national community don't achieve any kind of unity because you've got an elite on top that is looking after its own interests rather than thinking about how do you build a nation as a whole, as a coherent thing. He says the National Front, which has forced colonialism to withdraw, cracks up and wastes victory it has gained. It's a huge revolutionary potential that is squashed by local elites that are diverting that victory to serve their own interests. And with this you get religious rivalries. So in local regions, these might be various traditional religions. In big towns, you get conflicts between Islam and Catholicism, and sometimes Protestantism as well. And he thinks this is actually exploited by the former colonizers, and he talks about ways in which things will be fomented and stirred up by portions of the press that have some loyalty to the past colonial regimes. He also says that the religious rivalries that emerge in the sort of discourses that you start seeing floating around in the public sphere and in political discussions start reflecting forms of racism that themselves come straight out of the colonial administration. They're just now being expressed by Africans against other Africans. He says, taking the continent as a whole, this religious tension may be responsible for the revival of the commonest racial feeling. Africa is divided into black and white, and the names that are substituted, Africa south of the Sahara, Africa north of the Sahara, do not manage to hide this racism. Here it is affirmed that white Africa has a 1,000-year-old tradition of culture, that she is Mediterranean, that she is a continuation of Europe, that shares the Greco-Latin civilization. Black Africa is looked on as a region that is inert, brutal, uncivilized, in a word, savage. There, all day long, you may hear unpleasant remarks about veiled women, polygamy, and the supposed disdain the Arabs have for the feminine sex. All such remarks are reminiscent in their aggressiveness of those that are so often heard coming from settlers' lips. Disparaging remarks coming from a colonial past that are repurposed for local rivalries in post-colonial setting. And he contrasts this to bourgeois humanism, and he wants to walk a very careful line here. He's not going to say that the West has in any sense overcome racism, but you have these universalizing ideals that at least in principle seem to hold out the possibility of forms of freedom and forms of equality that encompass everybody. And he says, so why does that happen in one place and not in another? What governs it? And he says, well, the issue is that the bourgeoisie, at the point that it was able to move into social and political prominence in the core, was economically strong. It was potent economically. It had genuine material power. And because it had genuine material power, it had a level of confidence. It does not hesitate, Fanon says, to affirm positively certain democratic ideas which claim to be universally applicable. He says the Western bourgeoisie, though fundamentally racist, most often manages to mask this racism by a multiplicity of nuances which allow it to preserve intact its proclamation of mankind's outstanding dignity. Okay, so he's not trying to paper over the issues, but there is the holding out of the possibility for a universal, for something that is meant to be inclusive of everybody. And he says that this can happen because essentially this particular class is so secure in its competitive advantage that it's not really seriously worried about competition from anyone else. So it can offer gestures of inclusiveness because it doesn't think in practice anyone's going to be able to take advantage of them. Bourgeois ideology, however, which is the proclamation of an essential equality between men, manages to appear logical in its own eyes by inviting the sub-men to become human and to take as their prototype Western humanity, as incarnated in the Western bourgeoisie. So it's at least superficially universal. It is open in principle to other people moving in. It is also racist in that it positions those other people as sort of subhuman and presents its own type as the ideal human type. So this is not a glowing compliment for it, but it nevertheless sits in contrast to what Fanon is seeing in the newly independent nations. And so he's asking why you can get a universalizing ideology that can be openly expressed in one place, where you're getting the sort of disturbing forms of racism that he's been talking about in the other. And he returns to the idea that the national bourgeoisie in newly independent countries is itself an obstacle. It is not going through a revolutionary period. It is not doing something beneficial. It's just standing in the way of the development of a more unified national identity and a revolutionary approach to what's happening economically. It is opposed to the interests of the masses of African people. He says the people of Africa have only recently come to know themselves. They've decided in the name of the whole continent to weigh in strongly against the colonial regime. The national bourgeoisies, who are quite clear as to what their objectives are, have decided to bar the way to that unity, to that coordinated effort on the part of 250 million men to triumph over stupidity, hunger, and inhumanity at one and the same time. This is why we must understand that African unity can only be achieved through the upward thrust of the people, and under the leadership of the people, that is to say, in defiance of the interests of the bourgeoisie. Okay, so he's trying, in case anyone is suggesting that the bourgeoisie will be a revolutionary force, to suggest they're already an obstacle. We already need a new kind of revolution from below that is driven by and remains controlled by the masses in order to generate a meaningful unity whose interests are going to be served. Instead, what you get are a series of single-party states. And he says that the weak national bourgeoisie focuses on a single-party state because it's an efficient way to enforce its interests. He says the state, which by its strength and discretion ought to inspire confidence and disarm and lull everybody to sleep, on the contrary seeks to impose itself in spectacular fashion. It makes a display, it jostles people and bullies them, thus intimating to the citizen that he's in constant danger. The single party is the modern form of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, unmasked, unpainted, unscrupulous, and cynical. So push comes to shove, if you don't have the economic strength to guarantee that you'll come out on top in a state of competition, you'll make use of the state. Marx points out similar things with reference to the European states in their periods of capitalist expansion. So this isn't something that is specific to countries that are trying to develop in a recent period. Fanon talks about the fact that the state will then do a lot of prestige expenditures on public monuments and civic buildings that are kind of meant to intimidate with its majesty and its power, but puts very little investment into development. And increasingly, he thinks, disregards the interior of the country and develops ties to former colonial powers. So there's a personal profit to people that are high in the state administration, to a local elite bourgeois class, but there's not a redistribution and sharing of wealth and a redevelopment of the country to make everyone better off. And then he talks about leadership, and he says the leaders in these new states are very often people who were on the front lines in the anti-colonial struggle. So they have an enormous amount of public faith and trust invested in them because of what they sacrificed during that struggle and the leadership role that they played. He says, as soon as independence is declared, far from embodying in concrete form the needs of the people in what touches bread, land, and the restoration of the country to the sacred hands of the people, the leader will reveal his inner purpose, to become the general president of that company of profiteers, impatient for their returns, which constitutes the national bourgeoisie. So the leader over time loses the sort of immense gratitude that would have been invested in the leader due to their role in the anti-colonial structure, and comes to be seen increasingly cynically as nothing more than the representative of foreign companies and the national bourgeoisie. There's a gradual corruption and a growing of distance between the leadership and masses. And at the same time, because the leadership may have been really quite actively involved in the anti-colonial structure, Fanon offers the psychological interpretation that growing criticism of leaders can spark a very hostile, very harsh, very violent reaction, because it can appear as ingratitude for the anti-colonial work that the person or people genuinely did. So you get harsh repression that is driven not just by the needs of the state to maintain order, but is psychologically driven by someone who is furious that their sacrifices, their earlier sacrifices, are not being appreciated and acknowledged. And then the issue of neocolonialism again. So you get a national economy increasingly controlled from abroad. There are regular requests for funds from colonial powers because the new states don't have a fully functioning economy, have trouble balancing their books. And so you get former colonial powers regaining effective control over the economies by imposing conditions on the funds that they're providing. So there's an economic dependence on these former powers, even though they no longer have explicit administrative control. And you get an extreme inequality of wealth within the newly independent countries, and that's matched with an increasingly dictatorial approach to government to maintain order in a situation where wealth is not being equitably distributed. Fanon says the people stagnate deplorably in unbearable poverty. Slowly they awaken to the unutterable treason of their leaders. This awakening is all the more acute in that the bourgeoisie is incapable of learning its lesson. The distribution of wealth that it effects is not spread out between a great many sectors. It's not ranged among different levels, nor does it set up a hierarchy of half-tones. The new caste is an affront all the more disgusting in that the immense majority, 9/10 of the population, continue to die of starvation. The scandalous enrichment, speedy and pitiless, of this caste is accompanied by a decisive awakening on the part of the people and a growing awareness that promises stormy days to come. So you're getting a growing potential new mass-based revolutionary movement that's rumbling in the background. You get a strengthening of state power to suppress the movement. You also get, Fanon argues, a kind of romantic valorization of the anti-colonial struggle. So you get rituals and holidays and commemorations that Fanon thinks are attempts to pacify the people by deflecting them into nostalgic appreciation for what they achieved in the anti-colonial structure and to distract from the fact that there's not enough that's happened since that time. Fanon says this doesn't really work as distraction. The masses have no illusions, he says. They are hungry. And the police officers, though they are now Africans, do not serve to reassure them particularly. The masses begin to sulk. They turn away from this nation in which they've been given no place and begin to lose interest in it. The party is something that Fanon thinks during the period of actual anti-colonial struggle was a way to connect the masses with the leadership. And this is something that gets gutted as soon as independence is won. It ceases to function as a two-way transmission of ideas and a fruitful exchange of ideas between the leadership and the masses, and instead becomes a one-way kind of conveyor belt for how people are meant to behave that is directed by the state. Fanon says the living party, which ought to make possible the free exchange of ideas which have been elaborated according to the real needs of the mass of the people, has been transformed into a trade union of individual interests. Since the proclamation of independence, the party no longer helps the people set out its demands. They become more aware of its needs and better able to establish its power. Today, the party's mission is to deliver to the people the instructions which issue from the summit. There no longer exists the fruitful give and take from the bottom to the top and the top to the bottom, which creates and guarantees democracy in a party. Quite the contrary, the party has made itself into a screen between the masses and the leaders. He says that during the anti-colonial struggle there are militants that push for the development of more detailed planning about what's going to happen after, what sort of economy, what sort of governmental structures, and that this is sort of quietened during the movement itself. People are asked to put these issues aside because the important thing is just the anti-colonial struggle itself. But then once you get independence, that moment where these things were meant to be considered and meant to be hashed out and debated never actually happens. And the militants themselves are eased out of the party, and the party becomes something into which intellectuals and members of the elite middle class migrate and sort of channel to their own ends. So it's oriented to their self-enrichment rather than as an organ of trying to work out a view for the nation as a whole. Fanon says the party is becoming a means of private advancement. So it's something that someone joins because they're trying to move up in the state. It's not a place where you have a genuine ferment of ideas about the collective goals for everyone. And you get over time an increasingly oppressive state, and then an opposition that is needing to become violent in order to be heard because there's not a non-violent alternative for it. Fanon says you have a squabble over the spoils of the anti-colonial struggle, and you have special privileges and the granting of privileges that are specific to very small groups in the population, and then you get the multiplication of corruption. The party is used to keep the population demobilized and to hold them down and to prevent them from effective action against the government. And Fanon says this can spiral into what he calls fascism at high interest. And he says that this is the dialectic result of states which were semi-colonial during the period of independence. The army and the police become dominant social institutions, and the opposition becomes more aggressive and openly hostile to the national bourgeoisie. And he says the bourgeoisie, for its part, reveals itself incapable of understanding that it would be in its interest to draw a veil, even if only the flimsiest kind, over its exploitation. So it doesn't learn the lesson that the middle classes in the West have learned. It doesn't embrace any kind of universalizing veneer or inclusive veneer. It's just bold exploitation, and this accentuates the conflict. So these are ideas that we're going to return to. We'll return to the issue of dependency and escape from dependency, whether the current wave of globalization has affected the sorts of dynamics that Fanon is describing here, and also the issue of universals and where they reside and how they can be claimed both within and outside the core.